On a quiet Tuesday at around 1 in the morning, Dan Jones was jolted awake by the thunderous pounding of federal agents attempting to break down his apartment door at 7500 South Shore Drive in Chicago, and although their battering ram could not break through his double locks and he tried to return to sleep, the nightmare was only beginning, because when he woke up hours later ready to head to work, he stepped into a hallway filled with broken doors, empty apartments, and an eerie silence where his neighbors had once lived. And Jones, just 27 years old, was left staring at the aftermath of one of the largest and most aggressive federal raids carried out in Chicago in recent years, a raid that tore through nearly every unit of his building, leaving dozens of residents, many Venezuelan immigrants, but also U.S. citizens, detained, displaced, or traumatized. And what Jones described next captures the chaos, the anger, and the despair that still hangs over South Shore, because when he returned from work later that day, he entered his apartment only to find his electronics gone, his furniture missing, and his clothes and shoes scattered across the floor, with no explanation, no accountability, and no answers from Chicago police, leaving him defeated and furious. His words raw and direct: "I'm pissed off. I feel defeated because the authorities aren't doing anything." And that sense of abandonment was shared by his neighbors, who also experienced a level of disruption rarely seen in residential neighborhoods, with residents describing armed agents in full military fatigues blasting through doors in the dead of night, dragging men, women, and even children from their beds, sometimes naked, lining them up outside, some zip-tied for hours, with U.S. citizens among them. And the next day, the evidence of the raid was everywhere: children's toys scattered in the halls, shoes and food strewn across the floors, mattresses and shattered doors tossed into dumpsters by property managers, turning the building into a scene of destruction more reminiscent of a war zone than a Chicago apartment complex. While the Department of Homeland Security, through its official statement, said that 37 individuals were arrested in what they called a coordinated operation involving Border Patrol, the FBI, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, claiming that among those detained were people suspected of drug trafficking, weapons crimes, and immigration violations, but at no point did DHS provide concrete evidence tying the arrested individuals to the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, despite labeling the South Shore neighborhood as a gathering spot for its members. And this claim, vague and unsupported, stands in stark contrast to what the Chicago Sun-Times has consistently reported, that there is very little evidence linking Tren de Aragua to violent operations in Chicago, though isolated arrests have occurred in recent months. But those facts did little to ease the devastation for residents like 67-year-old Roderick Johnson, a U.S. citizen, who said agents blasted through his door, zip-tied his hands, and dragged him outside, forcing him to sit restrained for nearly 3 hours until they finally released him. And Johnson's account cuts to the heart of the controversy, as he recalled asking the agents why they were detaining him when he was an American citizen, demanding to know if they had a warrant and requesting a lawyer, only to be told to wait while they looked him up, a process that violated his sense of rights and dignity. And his words echo the frustration of many others who endured the operation, because across the street, resident Ebony Sweets Watson described what she witnessed as hundreds of agents flooding the block, deploying drones, helicopters, flashbang grenades, and military vehicles, dragging people, including small children, into the cold night without clothing and loading them into U-Haul vans, separating kids from their mothers, a scene she called heartbreaking and unbearable to watch, especially when she saw birth certificates, documents, and personal belongings scattered everywhere inside the building, water leaking into the halls, and chaos defining every corner, a level of disorder she described as wicked crazy. And Jones himself painted a picture of a community that had been stitched together by neighbors who may not have spoken English fluently, but nonetheless built bonds using translator apps, helping each other keep their shared spaces clean because the property owners had neglected their duties. People he described as good, kind, and supportive, and now he wonders what will become of their children, their homes, and their lives as the dust settles, because the building's history of code violations and absentee landlords makes him fear eviction for those still remaining, while advocacy groups like the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights are now scrambling to identify and support those taken, with spokesman Brandon Lee condemning the raid as a violent show of force executed in a residential neighborhood that inflicted trauma not just on the people arrested, but also on every single resident who witnessed it, because these kinds of operations are not easily forgotten and leave scars long after the agents drive away. And this South Shore raid was not an isolated incident, as a similar operation had just unfolded in suburban Elgin, where agents, accompanied by Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem herself, rolled up in a military vehicle, blasted through the front door of a home, and detained 6 individuals, 2 of whom were U.S. citizens, highlighting the growing scale and visibility of what the Trump administration has branded Operation Midway Blitz, a federal push that since September has flooded the Chicago area with immigration officers tasked with conducting sweeping raids. And these coordinated actions, executed with overwhelming force, are raising questions far beyond one building or one neighborhood, forcing Americans to grapple with how far the government is willing to go in its enforcement strategy, whether constitutional rights are being upheld, and whether families, many of whom include citizens and legal residents, are being caught up in dragnet operations justified with vague or unsubstantiated claims. Because for Jones, Johnson, Watson, and countless others in South Shore, this was not about politics or policy. It was about being jolted awake by flashbangs, about watching kids ripped from their mothers in the middle of the night, about walking into your apartment and finding your possessions stolen or destroyed, about standing zip-tied in the cold for hours while asking why and receiving no answers, about losing faith in the very authorities meant to protect you, and about living in fear of what comes next. And as property managers dump broken furniture and doors into dumpsters, as advocacy groups scramble to locate detained families, as journalists try to separate truth from government spin, and as South Shore residents pick through the ruins of their community, the core reality is unavoidable. A neighborhood was shaken, lives were upended, and trust was shattered by an operation that left more questions than answers. Because when federal agents roll through with military precision and heavy weaponry, breaking into homes in the dark, detaining citizens and non-citizens alike, scattering families, and then leaving behind debris, trauma, and confusion, the narrative becomes one not of justice but of fear, one not of safety but of instability, one not of order but of chaos.